So welcome to you all to this WEN Cafe on the new Wales Women's Rights Manifesto for the UK general election, which has been put together by the Gender Network. My name is Victoria Vasey. I'm the director of WEN Wales. WEN, as you all know, is an organisation which strives to make Wales a fair place for everyone. We connect women, we champion women, and we campaign on issues which will end gender equality in Wales. I mentioned that the manifesto was by the Gender Network. WEN does all its work in partnership. We have a fantastic membership of individuals and organisations, many of whom are here. Hello to you all. If you're not a member yet, I think there may be some membership details popping up. Thank you, Jess. Please do take a look and consider joining if you're not already a member. The Gender Network is a policy forum of 80 third sector representatives, activists and academics, all of whom are fighting for women's rights in Wales. WEN leads the Gender Network, but it's very much a coalition of organisations and individuals who work together. In this manifesto, we are calling on all political parties and candidates to put gender equality really at the heart of the election and all UK policy making. Our manifesto covers 6 areas. It's been difficult to whittle it down to 6, but as you will all know, less is sometimes more in getting our messages across in terms of campaigning. We really want to see political parties in these areas protecting and advancing greater gender equality in Wales and across the UK. We have almost six wonderful, wonderful speakers who are giving their time today to take us through each and every one of those 6 areas. It's quite a task to get through in not very much time. So I'm going to kick off with the wonderful, wonderful Hannah Griffiths, who is from Wales Women's Budget Group. She's the coordinator there, and she really is the powerhouse of the organisation, which is actually housed at WEN Wales now, I'm happy to say. So Hannah is not only a wonderful person, Wales Women's Budget Group is not only a wonderful organisation, but she's also now our colleague here at WEN. So Hannah, kick us off.
Thanks very much, Victoria. Hi, everyone. As Victoria said, I'm Hannah. I'm the coordinator of Wales Women's Budget Group. And I'm very pleased to be here today with you all to speak on the fair finance calls of the Wales Women's Rights Manifesto. So I'm going to start off by explaining a little bit about the economic position of women in the Welsh and UK economy. So due to persistent gender inequality, women across the UK bear a disproportionate share of caring responsibilities and are overrepresented in lower paid employment sectors such as health and social care, childcare and education. Those patterns mean that women are more likely than men either to be economically inactive or to be working in part-time, precarious and low-paid roles. The situation is even starker for women who experience intersecting disadvantage and discrimination. For example, ethnic minority, racialised or disabled women, as well as single mothers. So in the UK, women of colour are twice as likely to be on zero-hour contracts than white men. And in 2022, almost a third of disabled women reported being trapped in severely insecure work in the UK. In Wales specifically, 38% of single parents, 86% of whom are women, are living in relative income poverty. So that unequal economic position means that women earn less than men on average, and that's evidenced by our gender pay gap data, which in 2022 stood at 14.9% in the UK and 11.3% in Wales. There is some early indicative data for the gender pay gap in 2023, which suggests that that gap has actually increased in Wales to about 11.8%. So the gender pay gap means that women have less wealth and savings overall. And in the context of the current cost of living crisis, those inequalities are pushing women further into debt and poverty in Wales, which actually has the highest poverty rates in the UK. The same inequalities mean that women are more reliant on the social security system. In Wales, I think over 57% of universal credit claimants are women. But unlike the other devolved nations, Social Security is completely reserved in Wales, which means that any of the decisions taken for England with regards to Social Security at Westminster are also implemented here. That also means that some of the main levers to protect the most vulnerable in Wales and to address the unequal economic position of women in Wales actually rest with the UK government. So for that reason, we're calling on UK political parties and candidates to implement a number of fair finance recommendations. So firstly, we're calling on parties to increase the national living wage in line with the real living wage. You may have seen that the UK government did actually increase the national living wage in this year's autumn statement a few weeks ago. But that figure still sits below the real living wage, which is a figure set by the Living Wage Foundation, which is based on the actual cost of living in the UK. And that currently sits at £12 an hour in the UK. So we're calling on all parties to increase and retain the regular increasing of the national living wage in line with the real living wage to ensure that workers receive a wage that meets their everyday needs during the cost of living crisis, and to help support the women who are being hit hardest by its impacts. We are also calling for the increase in the real value of benefits and the regular uprating of benefits in line with the Consumer Price Index. You might have seen in the autumn statement that the UK government did increase benefits in line with September's CPI figure, which was 6.7%. That was a welcome measure, but we're calling on all political parties to ensure that benefits are regularly uprated in line with the CPI to avoid real terms cut for claimants, the majority of whom are women in Wales. We are also calling for the urgent reform of the UK social security system to ensure that it adequately supports women in Wales and across the UK. So those reforms include abolishing the benefit cap and two-child limit, creating an allowance for second earners within households with children or limited capability to work. To avoid exacerbating issues of financial dependency, we're calling for universal credit payments to be split between adults within a household. We're also calling for the removal of the no recourse to public funds condition on migrant visas, which prevents migrants from accessing certain forms of social security support, such as housing benefit. And finally, we're calling for a reduction in the severity and length of sanctions under universal credit. You might have seen back in March in the spring budget that the Chancellor expanded conditionality and sanctions to in-working claimants, non-working partners of claimants and lead carers of 1 to 2-year-olds. Each of those reforms disproportionately impact women, and the latter actually hits women in Wales the hardest. In the autumn statement a few weeks ago, unfortunately, conditionality was extended further to include disabled claimants and long-term sick, many of whom will now be subject to intensified work search requirements and possibly punitive sanctions. Notwithstanding their evidence ineffectiveness at moving benefit claimants off benefits into long-term sustainable employment, sanctions are also welfare worsening, and they're likely to exacerbate existing illnesses, putting more pressure on an already struggling NHS. So in light of those issues, we are also calling for the devolution of certain elements of social security to Wales, which is the case in Scotland, to ensure that the system meets the needs of people in Wales. Our fifth fair finance recommendation then is to the review of Wales's current funding arrangements and fiscal competencies. So under the current settlement, the Welsh Government basically has to wait for departmental spending changes in England in order to embark on any kind of big projects. That's not a very coherent way of financing an entire nation, particularly when Wales has a different demographic and social profile and different needs to the rest of the UK. For example, we have an older, less healthy population, which puts more strain again on the NHS. So in limiting the scope of Welsh policymaking, the current funding arrangements actually constrain the ability of Welsh Government to meet these needs and the needs of Welsh people. So we're calling for the urgent review of those recommendations. Moving on now to data issues then. In order to empower evidence-based policy decisions to understand their impacts on different groups and therefore to actually tackle inequality in Wales and throughout the UK, data, and particularly disaggregated data, is essential. So we're calling for the collection and publication of pay gap data for other protected characteristics disaggregated by gender, which is currently lacking both in Wales and across the UK, which will allow us to better understand the experiences of women facing intersecting discrimination. In a similar vein, we're calling for more companies to confront their gender pay gaps through lowering the statutory gender pay gap reporting threshold to include companies with 100 plus employees, and by introducing mandatory reporting on pay gaps by other protected characteristics, which, as I said, is currently lacking and should be disaggregated as a matter of routine. And then finally, to address these gaps, we're calling on the political parties to require these companies to produce action plans to tackle their reported pay gaps. And those action plans should have clear timelines and should be monitored by a public body. That's all from me for now on fair finance, but I look forward to the Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Hannah. Hannah has a wonderful ability to take seemingly impenetrable concepts and lots of statistics and make them understandable. So thank you very much. Of course, if there are questions on that, if they still need to, some of those things still need to be penetrated further, she'll be here later for questions. We're now going to turn to the wonderful Sarah Rees from Oxfam Cymru. Many of you here will know her. She has plenty of hats on. I think today she's going to be talking to us about caring responsibilities, and I know that's something that she's campaigned on sort of personally and professionally for many, many years. So Sarah, can I hand over to you, please?
Thank you, Victoria. I think before I start, just to go on from what Hannah was saying, I made a note about when we were talking about the gender pay gap, how closely this is linked to what we call the motherhood penalty, because the pay gap exponentially widens when you have children. You think of childcare costs, lack of decent flexible work, and that also means that women end up in pension poverty, and that's where this gap usually widens. So I just wanted to get that point in. So coming back to care responsibilities, I think what we've really got at the heart of this manifesto is a pillar about care and where that sits in Wales and where it could be in this manifesto. And it's that parents, unpaid carers, the childcare and social care workforce are an invisible network that holds society together. And more than that work is largely provided by women. This is work that is invisible and undervalued and upholds this current unequal status quo that we really have to change. So just delving a little deeper into that, care is crucial, it's important. You know, we saw in the pandemic how, you know, clapping and banging pots and pans was giving recognition to how important that is to our society and to how we function as communities. But more needs to be done. You know, banging pots and pans and giving that recognition was great. It was lovely for people to be recognised. But why, a couple of years later, after shining a spotlight on that, do we have this sector that's in crisis? And the value of unpaid care in England and Wales, and we only have this data at an England and Wales level, is estimated to be £162 billion. So we're reliant on women supporting this. When I think about this invisible network, you know, we are literally holding together society from collapse with the care work that we do. A lack of affordable childcare means that parents aren't able to work or increase hours, and we've seen the impact that pressure's had, what Hannah has mentioned. And when we talk about poverty, single parents have the highest in-work poverty rate, and we know that most of single parents are women. So childcare and poverty is essential. You know, a child is not in poverty alone. It's more likely because of inequality and because their mother is living in poverty. Across the UK, up to 1.7 million women are prevented from taking on more hours because of this lack of childcare. And that results in losses not only to communities and families, but 28 billion lost to our economy every year. We know that all of these elements of this care crisis are connected. Unpaid carers are propping up failing social care. Social care and childcare workers are underpaid and undervalued, and again, more likely to be women. And You know, this means that they're turning to alternative places of work, which results in staff turnover, gaps in provision. That means parents don't have the places to put their children into care, so they can't go to work themselves. You know, this whole system is reliant on women and is broken. And an historic lack of investment at a UK level means that's given us specific and unique challenges in our context. One of the things that we've put in here and that we really need to do is reward care work fairly, recognise it as the huge value that it has for us as society, and challenge some of those norms and policies that prevent men from taking an equal share in care. You know, some of the positives of COVID, you are seeing more fathers working from home, more fathers dropping children at school, but how do we involve men more widely in the social care sector, for example, because we know that when men are part of a work sector, then wages, and not only wages, but that recognition increases. So how are we going to do that? And the work that's done by the UK Women's Budget Group has suggested that an annual investment of 2.5% of GDP would generate 2 million well-paid jobs, raise our employment rate by 5%. And so we're really seeing not only the differences for equality, but also that that would help us meet our net zero targets. We can't look at a climate justice in Wales if we're not also looking at care and equality together. They have to be dealt with together. We can't manage one without the other. So what we've got in the calls that we have here are to invest to that 2.5% of GDP in childcare and in social care. All of this is social infrastructure that holds our society and our economy together. To raise carers allowance and increase the earning threshold for unpaid carers who are in receipt of carers allowance. And also to improve shared parental leave policies. We want non-transferable leave for fathers, better pay compensation, because only when we're built on that equal basis can we then move forward with having that equal share. And finally, to introduce a right for workers to have 5 to 10 days of paid care leave entitlement, to really start to recognise and see the invisibility as a core part of what we're doing. I also wanted to add on just of maybe pushing us a little further and being a little more radical in our thinking. And that's around this point of GDP. We don't just talk about GDP when we know that neoliberal economics sustains inequality. So maybe we also could have some of that conversation around more feminist, more decolonial pathways beyond GDP, one that recognises a caring economy where we'll have transitioned to not just a more equal Wales, but a greener and feminist Wales. Undervaluing that care economy pushes women deeper into time and income poverty, and that system that we're currently sitting in exploits carers. So how do we stop them being invisible and stop ignoring their role in sustaining our economies through doing some of these pieces? You know, this manifesto is one that's looking at a Wales that works for everyone, not just the 49% that are male, the 51% that are providing lots of this care work. And what we really have in this great piece of work is to turn this invisible, undervalued work that upholds this unequal status quo and a real change that we can see that will support women in the future. Thank you.
Sorry, everybody. It appears that Victoria has dropped out quickly. So in her place, can I just thank you, Sarah, so much for really, you know, explaining some of those connections. I think you also really made the link between the things we're seeing in the finance section that Hannah has just explained and how that links together with the continuing undervaluation of work that is mainly done by women, but also, you know, sketching the potential of what our society could look like if that was appropriately valued. I'd like to welcome then our next speaker, which is Leila Usmani, who has done some amazing work in various roles, including as policy lead in the Race Alliance Wales, where she has done some really important work on the underrepresentation of racialized people in public and political life. And Leila, can I kindly invite you to tell us a bit about equal representation and leadership section of the manifesto?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jess, and thanks everyone. Yes, as Jess mentioned, I did an in-depth piece of research in 2020 on racialised representation in public and political life in Wales. And that did cover some of the kind of intersectional aspects, including the representation of racialised women. Now, the context of women in general in Wales is that they're still underrepresented. They're underrepresented at all levels of UK politics. In Wales, women make up about 43% of members of the Senedd and about 36% of local authority councillors. We don't have the data for town and community councils. So work is being done. We're obtaining a lot of progress in Wales, but we do really need more work, and especially for women who face intersecting discrimination, including racism, ableism, and homophobia, and including trans women as well. Following the 2019 general election, 66 or 10% of members of parliament in central government were from minority ethnic backgrounds or racialized backgrounds, I prefer to say, with 37 of those identifying as women. The 2021 Senedd election, just 2 years ago, saw the first woman member of the Senedd from a racialized background since devolution, with overall only 5% of members of the Senedd from racialized backgrounds. And lack of reliable data on other protected characteristics makes it difficult to monitor progress at the local and national level, and therefore calls for the UK government to implement Section 106 of the Equality Act, which is part of the Gender Network Manifesto as well. This would facilitate essentially better data collection at the devolved level. Although it has been repeatedly ignored, we'll continue asking for that to be implemented. So in addition to this implementation, one of the areas that we believe is needed to accelerate this progress towards diverse and equitable representation is involving quotas. It has been seen that international evidence proves that quotas are the single most effective tool in fast-tracking not only women's representation, but the representation of other minoritized people and groups in society. Now, Wales is leading the way amongst the 4 nations, having committed to introducing gender quotas for the 2026 Senedd elections. And where we see these kind of intersectionally embedded quotas emerging as best practice across the world, we are asking for different ways to think about how these can be brought in, as currently there's no legal opportunity to be able to implement quotas for other characteristics beyond gender. On that then, I'm going to go through some of the asks of the manifesto beyond implementation of Section 106. One of the big areas is to focus on removing the 2030 sunset clause for all women shortlists to be able to ensure that shortlists for any protected characteristics can be used until no longer required. And building on that, we would like the Equality Act to be amended to enable the use of quotas and equivalent of all women shortlists going on from there after 2030. So we've got time to work towards that for sure. We've then got calls for political parties themselves, and myself at Race Alliance Wales, together with WEN, Disability Wales and Stonewall Cymru, have been working on producing recommendations for diversity and inclusion strategies for political parties. Again, as a bit of context, the Welsh Government is preparing legislation for Senedd reform at the moment, and that's also going to, as well as including provisions for an expansion of the Senedd. The Special Purpose Committee is looking at recommendations in relation to political parties' diversity and inclusion strategies. So that currently stands that the Welsh Government should encourage political parties to prominently publish their strategies and set out how the party has sought to facilitate diversity within its candidates at least 6 months prior to the scheduled Senedd elections. So considering those recommendations together with some of the elements of the manifesto, we're also calling on parties to consider nurturing of leadership talent amongst people who identify as women from underrepresented groups at all levels of government and public force through a range of measures. And it's important to recognise public sector, public leadership as well as political. Within this, it's really consideration about removing systemic, structural and institutional barriers and systems of oppression that are in place and that have maintained the current status quo. So some of the areas that are included in our manifesto are support for job sharing and remote working arrangements, recognising that we've now implemented flexible working requests from day one, that this should be seriously considered within public and political representation. Looking at a zero tolerance approach to discrimination, and with that thinking about how people can access recourse and implementing independent processes with meaningful sanctions to deal with allegations of any kind of violence or harassment. We're also calling for parties to expand and resource schemes for mentoring, coaching and shadowing. And with this, ensure information on becoming a candidate is easily accessible and proactively encourage people from marginalized backgrounds and communities to apply. Finally, kind of wrapping up this part of the manifesto, we really would like political parties to resource professional support networks, because going into public life can be a real avenue into political life as well. There's a lot of crossover, and we recognise that people have moved as well from the third sector into political life. So resourcing these, promoting them is really key. And where possible, is introducing these legally binding quotas for at least 50% women candidates and exploring the introduction of intersectionally embedded quotas post 2030, hopefully in line with best practice, and if not, exploring how other processes such as zipping can be utilised to encourage further diversity and representation across political life. I will end there, bring me onto time, and pass back to Victoria, who I think is back. Thank you.
I am back. Forgive me. You can clearly do very, very well without me. So, you know, I just want to sort of say a belated thank you to Sarah. I dropped off, I think, just as she was coming to the end. And Layla, fantastic. Thank you so much. I wanted to introduce you as probably one of the most expert people that we could possibly find on this topic. And I don't think I need to say any more, because you've proven that. Thank you. And I'm sure people will have questions for you later. We're now going to turn to the area of the manifesto, which is around tackling gender health inequalities. And I am going to pass over to Kirsty Pringle, who has very, very kindly agreed to do this at fairly short notice. So treble thanks to you for that. Kirsty is a long-standing volunteer for fair treatment for the Women of Wales, which is a pan-Wales patient-led disabled people's organisation, and she's been a trustee there since April of this year. Kirsty, over to you.
Thank you so much. Yes, as Victoria said, my name is Kirsty Pringle, and Victoria's already given a slight introduction. Thank you to FTWW, as we're known, Fair Treatment for the Women of Wales, and just to say, we support and advocate for women and people assigned female at birth who are disabled and or living with long-term health issues. So we are particularly focused on raising awareness of the intersectional health inequalities women experience. This is where protected characteristics such as ethnic origin or disability and other circumstances such as living in socio-economic deprivation or having communication differences come together to impact negatively on women's health and well-being. We were very pleased to ask to contribute to this manifesto ahead of the UK general elections and provide some information about the health inequalities experienced by our members and many other women across the UK. As this manifesto was being developed, there was quite a bit of discussion about whether or not to include health because of it being a devolved matter in Wales. However, whilst it is true to say that management of Wales's NHS lies with the Welsh Government, many of the levers, as we've heard other speakers describe as well, which can be used to improve health and wellbeing, more broadly lie with the UK Government. So this starts with addressing socio-economic disadvantages which lead to poorer health for women across the UK and in Wales. It is often thought that women are doing okay because they have a longer life expectancy than men. In fact, in recent years in the UK, the gap between women and men's life expectancy has shrunk, with life expectancy for the poorest women falling faster than anyone else. Whilst women still live very slightly longer than men, they live more of those years in ill health, with fewer years disability-free than men. Evidence shows that women's decreasing life expectancy and poor health can be linked to things like poverty, insecure employment, and reductions in welfare support, as well as healthcare. Women tend to be at increased risk of being poor, and the links between poverty and ill health are strong. We've already heard mention. Women also take on a greater role of caring for children and elderly family members, which increases stress levels and affects health. Addressing the widespread factors that lead to poverty and improving the welfare system so that women are not disadvantaged are in the UK Government's gift and could play a vital role in reducing health inequalities for women now and in the future as we get older. We also wanted to see the manifesto highlight the role the UK Government can play in, firstly, research. In the UK, the vast majority of research into health-related matters and clinical trials, which is where causes and treatments of diseases are investigated, are funded and carried out in England. The findings will then be extrapolated to Wales, usually in the form of clinical guidelines, such as those developed by NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. Historically, medical research has not always included females because of concerns about possible current or future pregnancy and a belief that women's hormones would complicate things, making trials more time-consuming and expensive. Excluding women from medical research has perpetuated the misperception that diagnosis and treatment are the same across sex and gender. In a number of different disease areas, this has led to diagnostic delays and poorer outcomes for women. Evidence also shows that diseases linked to menstruation or gynecology don't attract much interest or funding when it comes to research, and nor do conditions which have a disproportionate impact on women, such as autoimmune diseases or ME, as an example. At present, clinical trials still tend to primarily enrol male, mostly white patients. This manifesto recommends that the UK Government does more to address inequities in medical research, including ensuring that any clinical trials it funds or supports are equitable and more diverse. This should lead to better healthcare for women across the UK and in Wales. Better and more funded medical research would also influence training for healthcare professionals. Evidence shows that most healthcare professionals in Wales will have trained elsewhere, usually in England, largely because Wales doesn't have many medical schools. It is also important to note that patients in Wales will often have to access healthcare in England and vice versa. The UK Government should have a role to play in developing training, which includes identifying and addressing unconscious biases and prejudices, which can see women's reporting of symptoms not taken seriously and ensuring that women's voices are heard in their healthcare encounters. This type of training could help to reduce instances of poor care, which have been widely reported in. For example, inquiries about the use of mesh to treat incontinence, pain when having the coil fitted, and inadequate maternity services, to name but a few. Common themes across all of these areas have been women not feeling like they are given accurate information and that they are ignored when they express concerns. The UK Government needs to learn lessons from these inquiries and look at how training for healthcare professionals might help to avert such problems in the future. And finally, both healthcare professionals and patients would benefit from improved rights in the workplace. Here, we wanted to see the manifesto call for increased awareness and better workplace support for those affected by symptoms of menstrual health conditions, menopause, fertility treatment, and miscarriage. Evidence suggests that 89% of women have experienced anxiety and stress in the workplace due to issues relating to their menstrual and gynecological health, and what a significant number of women in the prime of their careers leave due to symptoms of menopause. This is a huge and avoidable loss to employers and the economy, as well as negatively impacting on women's lives, health, and well-being. The manifesto also calls for paid leave for those who experience miscarriage in the first 24 weeks of pregnancy. Currently, women can find themselves having to use their annual holiday entitlement to recover from what can be a hugely traumatizing experience physically and emotionally. The fact that this type of loss isn't currently recognised can have a profound and long-term impact on mental health. This isn't good for women, their families, or the places that employ them. The UK government has a key role to play in improving women's health related experiences in the workplace, which would be good for women, good for their employers, and the wider economy. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kirsty, very much for that. It's us that are thanking you. I'm now going to move on to the huge topic of ending violence against women and girls. We have the absolutely wonderful Nancy Ledubui here to talk to us on that topic. She has very, very many years of experience working in various organisations, including BAUSA, where she's a policy manager. I should also give her a particular shout out because she's a trustee at WEN, and we are grateful for all her work that she does with us directly in that respect. So Nancy.
Thank you very much, Victoria. I have to apologize first. I came in late because I had a long meeting in Cardiff, which went on until just after 3 o'clock. So I was rushing to get back to Swansea and log in, and I've just caught a bit of what is happening. So thank you very much for that. I'm just going to go direct and talk about the subject of ending violence against women and girls, and within the WEN Manifesto, because I remember I was part of that team that was looking at that. So I don't want us to, to forget that. I want participants to remember that. And when we talk about violence against women, we can't really talk about that without looking at the figures. We need to look at what the statistics are telling us, which is obvious that women and girls are disproportionately affected by violence that is male perpetrated. And I want to just share with you some of the figures that are there so that, we can put into context what exactly we are talking about. I want to look at first some of the figures. I've come across that are global figures from UN, and which are really worrying figures when we talk about ending violence. So it's up to us to ask ourselves, what exactly are we going to put in place if we are really to tackle violence against women and girls? When I look at those figures, I can see from what I have is that it is estimated that in 2020, about 1.7 million females were victims of violence. That is the crime survey figures for England and Wales. I'll talk about the UN figures later, and this is just the UK figures. But again, when we go into the details in terms of disaggregated data, we tend to have gaps in terms of understanding exactly what the situation is in Wales. And in all the areas around violence against women, domestic abuse, we are talking about forced marriage, because I come from an organization that supports women, victims of forced marriage, female genital mutilation, we are talking about honor-based violence. That data is not disaggregated to Wales, and it becomes a little bit difficult to get that information and therefore to support the women who are victims. And when I go back now to the UN figures that I wanted to share with all the attendees here, is that it's estimated for 2022, UN Women, the figures they looked at in 2021, that 45,000 women and girls were killed by intimate partners or other family members, which translates to about 5 women or girls being killed every hour. And further below, I can see from the information I've gathered from that is that every woman or girl, one woman or girl is killed every 11 minutes. And if we think of it, that the 2 hours we are going to be in this meeting, if we start to calculate how many women or girls will have lost their lives through violence perpetrated by someone who is close to them. Then I want to talk about the homicide statistics in England and Wales, and I'm looking at the available data between 2010-11 to 2021-2023, and I can see about 198 victims of homicide were recorded in England and Wales, who are women. Again, putting that into perspectives, and 9 out of those 10 of homicide suspects were males. So it's about thinking about those statistics. I now want to come back again to the subject within what we are doing in WEN, and talk about the data that is available from Welsh Women's Aid, which shows that about 22%, there was about 22% increase in contacts from survivors and 43% increase in contacts from concerned others in 2021. Then, as I've already mentioned, and I think someone else must have mentioned around capacity in terms of resources to address some of these issues we are talking about. There is that lack of capacity and lack of adequate resources. And when you talk about women from Black and minority ethnic women, they are always faced with the barrier of accessing public funds. They're always seen as not equal to public funds, which is a huge barrier to women coming forward and disclosing that they're victims of violence and they need that support because of 2 things here. One, the perpetrator always uses that to control the woman, that if you go out and disclose that you are experiencing this form of abuse, then you are going to be deported, or no one is going to listen to you, or you're not going to get that support you need because you don't have any recourse to public funds. And 2, the fear of just losing their children. A lot of times they're being brainwashed. If you go out and disclose, social services are going to take away your children. And that means that staying in an abusive relationship is a safer place for them. And it provides that protection they need for themselves, but also for the children. Then we've got issues to do with structural misogyny, which we just have to deal with as, you know, a women's network in public sectors. We haven't forgotten about Sarah Everard. We haven't forgotten about Nessa. And there are many millions of other women who, again, are abused in public spaces. It's something that we constantly have to be thinking about, but also constantly reminding the policymakers, reminding the police, people who are there who are supposed to be protecting women and making sure that public spaces are safe spaces for women to walk, for women to go out and meet friends, but also to walk safely back home. Then issues around criminal justice, the criminal justice system and family courts. A lot of times we've always been informed by survivors that they are failed by the criminal justice system. I can see you smiling, Victoria. I hope I'm not overrunning my 10 minutes. Yeah. And again, it's those sort of issues we really, really need to think about. And I'm happy that I'm having these conversations this time when we are looking at, elections coming up. What is it that we want to tell the politicians? What is it that we want to tell the policymakers? There are a lot of issues to do with women, and we feel that women, we are almost an afterthought in terms of this. And then I want to bring in the issue of devolved governments. Do we have devolved powers in terms of holding, CPS criminal justice, to account for the many failings that we keep hearing from survivors? Across the UK, conviction rates for rape and sexual assault have almost halved between 2016 and 17 and 2020 to 2021. Police systematically fail to act on domestic abuse reports. We've heard about that a lot of times in the media, even when it is by, their own officers are perpetrators. We've heard about it, but they don't seem to be doing much around that. And then I've mentioned a bit around the no recourse to public funds, and I just want to link that with Article 59 in the Istanbul Convention, where we still have issues with the UK Parliament not really being keen in adopting that. And that is very important for a lot of the women, especially asylum seekers, migrants, and other minority groups. However, there have been a bit of positives, which we need to recognize, that the Home Office in 2021 did put in place a pilot project, the SMV project, to just kind of provide that crisis fund for organizations like BAUSO through the Southall Black Sisters for women to access safe accommodation and financial support to a point where they're no longer insecure and they're safe, and then they can then move on. And then in Wales, when you look at our own government here, the Minister for Social Justice and Chief Whip Jane Hart, through her work, she's been campaigning a lot around violence against women, and she has supported BAUSO by launching again another fund, crisis fund, that survivors can access under no recourse to public funds. Now, moving forward, I just want to then talk about what we are asking. What is it that we want parties to do? I've mentioned about devolved powers, and it's about time that devolved powers over justice and policy into Wales to ensure women in Wales can benefit from a joined-up approach tailored to the Welsh context. We do not want to keep being an afterthought, but we want the UK government to be thinking that Wales is the nation on its own, that we can actually make legislation and policy that resonates with the public, and then make misogyny a hate crime. We need to be able to identify and eliminate structural misogyny across the public sector, including within the criminal justice system and family courts. We need to be able to ensure that all staff in police and courts are appropriately trained by specialist services to deal with gender-based violence, domestic abuse, and stalking in a trauma-informed way, to be able to expand the support for migrant victims who have no recourse to public funds, and then to provide equal protection for women, regardless of immigration status, by removing the reservation on Article 59 of the Istanbul Convention and abolishing no recourse to public funds. I want to talk a bit from our own perspective here in terms of implementing a firewall between immigration enforcement and statutory services. A lot of the service users who have come to us and the ones we have supported, they have come because they've got no way out. And for them, if we do not support them, then they're happy to, to leave the country because they're scared that every time they disclose, either to the police or to service providers, that information always tends to land with the Home Office. And they wake up in the morning and there is a knock on the door and they are victimized. So this is very important, that there needs to be a firewall between the kind of data that is shared with the Home Office, and then split payments as default for universal credit to prevent financial abuse, and introduce an exemption for survivors who have a change of circumstances due to violence and abuse from repaying advance universal credit payments. Encourage the Independent Press Standards Organization to adopt strong ethical standards on reporting on violence against women and girls. And finally, being able to ensure better data collection on violence against women and girls, including data disaggregation for Wales and for different forms of violence against women and girls, and consistent demographic categories across government bodies. I just want to add on that we've just completed a research on forced marriage in the UK. And again, it was very difficult for us to get any disaggregated data that is just Wales-based data. So that point is very important. Thank you very much. I'm happy to receive and respond to any questions.
Nancy, thank you so very much. Very rich. I could listen to you all evening, all afternoon. I was smiling because you had presented a catalogue of seemingly insurmountable and dire the situation in terms of violence against women and girls, and then you moved so simply to the question of having more direct control over the criminal justice system and policing, and it just sounded such a simple fix to such a huge problem, or at least part of the fix. We're running a little bit over time, so I'm going to pass very quickly to Rachel Minto, Dr. Rachel Minto, in fact, who is an academic, a feminist academic from the Department of Politics and International Relations at Cardiff University, and she's a member of the Wales Governance Centre. She has a background in European gender equality politics and is now primarily exploring questions around the UK's withdrawal from the EU from a territorial perspective. She's also a trustee of the Wales Women's Budget Group, and she is going to talk to us about the very, very narrow, small issue of women's rights in maybe less than 9 minutes. Rachel, thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to speak to you about the asks from the Gender Network with respect to women's rights. And we are really aware that in this space, we are building on the tremendous work of advocates before us who have secured provisions, legislation, agreement, funds to advance women's rights and gender equality at the international, European, UK, and also Wales level. So broadly, what we're asking for is to make sure that we make maximum use of the agreements that we have in place, that we don't roll backwards in terms of our legislation or our funding commitments, and also that we plug gaps and that we make the necessary changes to make sure that our legislative framework is fit for purpose and does justice to the women in the UK, in Wales and across the UK. So I'm going to start with looking at that international level and drawing attention to CEDAW, so the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Now, this was adopted by the UN in 1979. It was ratified by the UK in 1986, and what we are calling for is for the incorporation of CEDAW into UK legislation. So this is significant because this convention is known as an International Bill of Rights for Women, and we would like to see this brought to life through legislation in the UK. Secondly, we look at that European level. Now, obviously, the UK has now left the European Union, but whilst we were a member state, there were many hard-won victories with respect to women's rights and gender equality. So that EU legislation has covered significant pressing issues such as equal treatment, employment protections with respect to pregnancy, maternity, and part-time work. So it's essential that we secure that EU, what was EU legislation, into UK law. Now, as it stands, that EU legislation has been captured under what is termed EU retained law. However, we have seen that that legislation has come under threat, which brings also threatens that important safety net that is provided by that legislation. So we are calling for the incorporation and protection of that legislation that came from the European level and needs to be fully brought into the UK legal framework. Now, there is another question related to the UK's former EU membership, and that is with respect to EU funding. Now, for equality organisations, structural funding from the European Union was a really significant part of keeping these organisations alive and promoting the work they were doing around women's rights and gender equality. There were promises from the UK government about the replacement of these EU funds. However, what we have seen in practice is really woeful in terms of what the UK Shared Prosperity Fund has been able to provide to women's and girls' organisations. So we have the figures from 2021, and we see just 1.8% of the total value of grants awarded in the UK went to women's and girls' organisations. So we are calling for the adequate funding for women's organisations and for the equality sector more broadly to replace that EU funding that we can no longer access. Then we want to think about that UK level, and there are three particular strands to this. The first is with respect to the Equality Act. So the 2010 Equality Act, which, as I'm sure you all know, was a significant moment for consolidating and strengthening protections against discrimination with respect to a number of protected characteristics. Now, we are very concerned that there have been proposals to amend the Equality Act with respect to its understanding of sex and to move that definition to biological sex, so to restrict it to biological sex. And we believe that this will have really deleterious impacts, not least for trans women and also for women perceived as gender non-conforming. So we are saying stop to those proposals to amend the Equality Act. Then I come to the hostile environment. Now, this approach to irregular immigration, which is often termed illegal immigration, and for anybody just listening, I use inverted commas when I say illegal immigration. So this irregular immigration, it was introduced in 2012 in order to make the UK an unhospitable place for people who arrive and seek to stay in the UK through that irregular route. And what we want to draw attention to is the particularly vulnerable position of migrant women within that hostile environment. They face a double discrimination as women and as migrants, and are at risk of destitution, abuse, exploitation in housing, employment, relationships. So what we are asking for is for the UK to honour its obligations to support all refugees, and this includes those climate refugees. Now, the final point that I want to draw our attention to, and it was the point that the Gender Network wanted us to stress as part of this launch of the manifesto, And this is about a very archaic piece of legislation that we still have on the statute books in Great Britain, which is called the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act. And this is all about the legalisation of abortion. Now, as it stands in Great Britain, if a woman seeks an unregulated abortion or tries to terminate without medical support her abortion, then she is acting unlawfully and is at risk of a life prison sentence. Now, what we argue here is that the issue of abortion must be treated as one of access to healthcare. And we need to acknowledge that women have the right to be able to make decisions about their bodies and their lives. They also have to be afforded access to healthcare, and there are occasions where the most vulnerable women are in our society, perhaps those the ones who are experiencing gender-based violence, who are at risk of honour-based crimes, are the most vulnerable when it comes to actually accessing that healthcare. So that is one of our key asks with respect to the decriminalisation of abortion. I hope that gives you a good overview of where we stand in terms of around women's rights and gender equality.
Rachel, wonderful as ever. Thank you very, very much. And you did that very quickly for me. So thank you so very much. I started by saying less is more when trying to write this manifesto, but I think we can well appreciate that less is still an awful lot. And there is a huge amount of work and thought and research and passion that has gone into developing this manifesto. And a question here, and Jess, thank you, has put it in the chat, so those of you who haven't actually read the whole text can do, and I encourage you to do so. I have a question here. How do I, as a supporter of the recommendations in this manifesto, ensure that they are listened to? That's a big question. Do I have anyone who would like to tackle it? Sarah, please.
Thanks. I think it can be kept really simple. And if there's something, having read it, if there's something that really talks to you and your values and what you care about, when politicians are asking for input, tell them. Keep talking about it, create this echo chamber so that everywhere we're talking about all these things together, and all of a sudden it won't be an echo chamber, it will be embedded into their policies. When anybody knocks on your door asking for your vote, ask them about the thing in this manifesto that really makes a difference to you and where you want to see. And that's where these differences can really make change. Thanks.
Brilliant, Sarah. I think that probably just about does it. Does anyone want to add to that?
Just, sorry, quickly, Victoria, I think there's some tweets that have been shared during the meeting. So if anyone wants to share them to their own Twitter accounts, that would be great as well, to raise awareness of the issues that we've been discussing.
Fantastic. And I think, just as I have said, there is so much expertise in this, on this screen, this virtual room, and within the gender network that has sort of fed into this. If people want to reach out and they want more information, then that's what we're here for later.
Thank you. Yeah, Sarah got there first. And I think in addition to what Sarah said, what I would say is sharing my own experience, especially as a woman of color, but I know a lot of women have this, of feeling like they've got imposter syndrome, like they might be seen as being aggressive, and all of this kind of stuff that gets shoved down our throats. And especially as a woman of color, it's the kind of angry brown woman, angry black woman. And I used to feel very anxious about kind of saying these things. How would I say them in a palatable way? How would I push them? And I've recently learned that actually it doesn't matter. And if you're worried about your professional career, I've got a lot further by just being in those spaces. being really assertive with what I'm asking for and saying, no, you need to listen. And I think you'll start finding that people will. Whether they agree with it or not, that's different, but more and more people will listen to you, more and more people will start thinking about it, and this is becoming more and more part of the Overton windows. So it's just being brave, and that is kind of what we're working towards, is not really caring that much about, am I gonna this, that, and the other. Like, try and push that out and bring in your bravery and your strength to just keep saying it.
I think on that really, really positive note, we can probably wrap up proceedings. Thanks, Layla. And thanks to all the panelists who've given so generously of their time and have been absolutely fantastic this afternoon. Thank you to those of you who've joined us. Thank you to those who are listening. You may see that a poll has just popped up. I'd really like you to take a minute to fill that in, if you could, less than a minute. And I would also like to probably get told off by saying thank you to all the team at WEN behind the scenes who make these work, particularly to Jess, who we can just about see, and to Megan Evans, who has done amazing work behind the scenes to make all of this this work. You may well know that we've got an AGM, which is due to start in 3 minutes. So we've done it. Thank you all for sticking to time and being so fantastic. I think we'll take a quick 2-minute break and then kick off again.